Hello, this is Catherine from Accelerated Reader. Today, I will be reading The Butterfly, Bee Lady, and the Bee, written by Ig Oliver. Before I begin reading, I would like to give a big thanks to author Ig Oliver for sending me this book to read on my channel. In the description below, I have included links where you may find and purchase this book, as well as Part 2. About the author. The author, Ig Oliver, has worked all around the world as a chef and has proved himself to be a world-class chef, but now he puts pen to paper to apply his imagination to another dish. An imaginative and enthralling plate through fictional writing and beautiful illustrations. A new writer with stories to tell from his own imagination, inspiration, and experiences, from big cities to small country villages, amazing countries, and friends. Don't forget to like and subscribe. To my daughters, Farhana and Indiana. The Butterfly, Bee Lady, and the Bee, written by Ig Oliver. Acknowledgements. It was never my intention to publish this book, as it never really crossed my mind. But I have to say thank you to my daughter, Indiana, who decided after listening to the usual traditional stories every night, and the occasional mini made-up stories I tell, like the goldfish who swam the sewer. She wanted a proper made-up one, so I had to come up with something a bit better than the usual. My imagination set to work. Once upon a time, there was a butterfly who thought she was a bee. She wore a yellow striped dress. Of course, I couldn't finish it that night, so the following night I had to continue adding more to the story. And the next night, and the following night, it went on for a week. Eventually, I decided to write it down. That's when it turned into a full-blown story. So, Indiana Oliver, thanks for that. As time went on, I finished the first sample book. I sent a copy to my sister Jackie and parents, who said it was a great story, but picked me up on some bad grammar. I decided to send it to some publishers, and it was Austin Macaulay Publishers who picked it up and said, yes, it's good enough to stand against any well-established author. So, thank you, Indiana. Thank you, Sister Jackie. Thank you, Mom and Dad. Thank you, Austin Macaulay. Thank you also, my friends, inspiring me to now complete Part 3. Was it the thought to write that changed us? Or was it the thought that we should? By Ig Oliver. Once upon a time, a long time ago, about the time my mother was 8, in a garden in the countryside, there lived a beautiful butterfly called Bee Lady. She spent her summer days buzzing around the meadows and paddocks, flying between the trees and the flowers. She had the most beautiful wings, full of colors, like a spring rainbow. But nature had worked a strange magic on her, and she thought that she was a bee, a belief fueled by the fact her dress was patterned with black and yellow stripes. One day, she was fluttering through the daisies when she came across a big round bee who was collecting nectar from all the flowers. His pockets were bulging with the yellow pollen powder. He looked very busy. "Hellos," Bee Lady said as she landed on a big daisy, which bent and wobbled slightly as she came to rest. "Hellos," replied the bee, who stopped what he was doing and turned towards the butterfly. "Hows can I help yous?" he said with a big smile, drawing out his hanky, which was covered in pollen. Making a puff of yellow cloud, he wiped the sweat from his brow. "Ohs," Bee Lady replied, "I just thought I'd come over and see how you were doing. As a bee myself, I thought I might be able to help." The bee looked at her with a surprised, wide-eyed expression. He was about to mention the fact that she wasn't a bee when she continued, "Isn't it a lovely day for collecting pollen?" as she started stuffing pollen in her striped dress's pockets. Yes," said the bee, looking slightly bemused. He did not want to seem rude by mentioning that she was a butterfly, not a bee, although a rather strangely dressed butterfly. She had a yellow striped dress, which didn't match her beautifully colored wings. But, being a very polite bee, he didn't want to appear rude or impolite. And in any case, the butterfly seemed to be very nice. She had a gentle, kind face, and had even tried to speak in bee language by adding Z's to her words, which he found quite amusing. "Yes, it's a beautiful day for collecting pollen. It's warm and dry, just perfect. The best day so far's this summer," the bee continued. "Sorry, I didn't catch you's name," raising his eyebrows as though he had misheard her introduction earlier. "My name is Bramley," he said. "Ohs, I'm so sorries," said the butterfly with a bright smile. "I didn't introduce myself properlies. My name's Bee Lady." She promptly fluttered to the ground and curtsied to the bee called Bramley. Bramley smiled at her and, in return, bowed. "The pleasure is all mine," he said, as he stood up straight. The rest of the day, the two unlikely-looking new friends spent time chatting and collecting pollen until the sun turned a deep red and started to sink down and set behind the trees and hills. "Will you be here tomorrow, Bramley?" asked Bee Lady. "Oh, yes, I'll be here. Lots of work to be done before the summer comes to an end." "Okay, I'll see you tomorrow," said Bee Lady. And as she did, she lifted gracefully into the air, waved, and was gone. Over the next few weeks, Bramley and Bee Lady met up in the garden. They spent the days collecting pollen, chatting, flying through the flowers, catching the warm breezes under their wings, meeting with other friends, and having lots of fun. Bramley was so happy to have Bee Lady as a friend. She was always joking and playing tricks on him and making him laugh. He found it so funny when she spoke in bee, but he never mentioned to her that she wasn't really a bee. He was too polite. One day, for no reason, Bee Lady never appeared, and Bramley was a little sad as she had not told him she wouldn't come to the garden. She was always up bright and early to meet him. Bramley thought maybe she was a little tired, or maybe he had not heard her mention she wouldn't be around that day. So he carried on with his day, although it was not as eventful and fun as when Bee Lady was about. The next day, Bee Lady did not appear again, and Bramley became a little concerned. So he asked a few friends whether they had seen Bee Lady, but none could say they had seen her. "Maybe she's gone on a holiday," said Mr. Weevil, who was dragging large sacks of flour through his front door, stopping for a moment to rub his long snout. "Or just visiting family." "Yes, possibly," said Bramley, as he buzzed his wings harder and rose above the grass. "Well, if you see her, let her know I was looking for her," shouting as he rose higher and higher. Bramley spent the next week worrying about his friend as there had been no sign of her. But he had to keep working and collecting pollen for the hive, as collecting pollen was very important. He occasionally asked passers-by and acquaintances if they had seen the butterfly lady with the yellow striped dress. But no one had. It was on the 8th day Bramley was just loading his pollen into a wheelbarrow when he heard a voice he knew. "Hello, Bramley," said the voice. Bramley turned around, and there she was, fluttering and hovering behind him. She was smiling, and the sun twinkled in her eyes. Bramley tried to hide his happiness to see her, as he was a little annoyed because she had left without saying anything. But he couldn't. He was too happy to see her. He buzzed over to her, put his arms around her, and hugged her, and said, "I missed you. Where's did you go?" Bee Lady looked at him and smiled again. "It's a long story. Maybe I could tell you over a cup of honey teas, or maybe if you have time, I could take yous and show you." "Shows me?" Bramley questioned. "Yes," Bee Lady said. "Maybe it would be better to show yous," she said, still smiling. Bramley thought for a moment, but only a short moment. "Yes, okay, I'll come with you." Bramley followed Bee Lady, happy to know she was okay. Bee Lady waved him on towards her. "Let's go," she said. They rose up through the tall, scented flowers of bluebells, cowslips, clovers, and dandelions and sped off, whipping through the leaves on the trees, catching the breeze towards the distant meadows. After a while, Bee Lady stopped at a large tree with buddleia flowers, lilacs, sage, marjoram, and tall sunflowers, all growing around the tree. The scent of the flowers filled the air with beautiful aromas. Bramley settled on the branch of the big tree, breathed in deeply, and filled his lungs with the wonderful smelling air. He looked across towards Bee Lady, who was staring up into the tree with her beautiful smile. "So," Bramley spoke softly, "is this what you wanted to shows me's?" Bee Lady's wings fluttered slightly, and her eyes rested again on Bramley. "Yes," she replied, smiling. "I'm sorry I disappeared without saying anything, but something happened, something wonderful. It was very sudden in the morning, and I couldn't leave my home, my tree." Bramley looked intrigued. "Wonderful?" he asked. "Yes," said Bee Lady, as she raised her eyes upwards again towards a large green leaf dangling above their heads. Bramley followed her gaze towards the leaf. "My babies," Bee Lady whispered. Bramley stared at the leaf. His eyes suddenly focused on a small cluster of yellowy golden eggs with stripes on. He blinked and stared harder. And after a moment, he said, "You've had babies?" 91, to be exact, Bee Lady said, with a little giggle to her voice. They both stared for a while up at the leaf, both with different thoughts, until Bramley spoke. "Well, I understand now why you disappeared, but I'm so happy you came back and brought me to this place. I understand now why your home is here. It's so beautiful and such a nice tree to raise your family in," said Bramley. Bee Lady moved closer to Bramley. She smiled and took his hand in hers. "You are a good friend, Bramley," she said. "You're honest, and I love you dearly, and I trust you." Her eyes saddened as she spoke. "But I have to go a ways." "Go a ways?" Bramley repeated, staring at her, feeling sudden alarm, unsure of what she meant. "Yes, Bramley, I have to take a journey. A long journey. A journey—" She stopped. A tear dropped from her eye and landed on Bramley's hand. He stared down at it. "I must go. It's difficult to explain. I wouldn't go unless I had to. It's very important, and I just need you to understand." "You're not coming back, are you?" Bramley asked. "I want you to watch over my children and keep them a secret," Bee Lady said, still holding his hand. "Visit when you can, just to make sure they're safe. I know you're a good bee, and they'll need a good bee to guide them." Bramley didn't know what to say. He hovered silently, shocked at the unexpected revelation. And then, as a gentle wind rustled the leaves around him, he said, "I've never done this before. I wouldn't know what to do. Why do you have to go?" Bee Lady smiled. "You'll know when the time comes. You'll know. You only have to pass by and check that they're okay." As she said this, she leant forward and kissed Bramley on his forehead and whispered, "I have to go. I have to go now." She fluttered her wings and rose up towards the leaf where her eggs lay and pulled out of her pocket some golden pollen. Bramley had never seen golden pollen before. He watched as she blew gently on her hand, and it flew up around the eggs. But, Bramley stuttered. Don't goes." Bee Lady looked down on Bramley as she fluttered her wings, moving backwards and further away. "I must go. Thank you, Bramley. Thank you, and I trust you." At this, she suddenly spun around, her wings fully open, and caught an unexpected breeze and was gone. Bramley flumped backwards and sat on the branch, stunned at what had just happened, emotions running wildly through his mind and body, anger, confusion, and loss. He pulled out his hanky and blew his nose. The next morning the sun was barely up, and Bramley sat on the edge of an old mill stone, which was used as a sundial in the garden. His mind was not on the day's work which lay ahead. He was already missing his friend, the Bee Lady. His emotions still in shock, worried about where and why she had gone, and in such a hurry. Finding himself the sole custodian of 91 baby eggs, he felt alone. He needed some good advice, he thought. There's only one person who could help, and that he could trust, whom all bees trust, the Queen. Though getting an audience with the Queen was going to be tough. He had to have a good reason. Suddenly, he remembered the gold pollen the Bee Lady took from her pocket and blew on the eggs. "Yes," he said out aloud, "I must go back and collect some of the gold pollens and show the Queen. I'm sure she has never seen it before." He stopped, realizing he was talking out aloud. He quickly looked around to see if anyone was listening. He was alone. He jumped up, buzzed his wings, and headed back to the great tree. Bramley flew near to the eggs, making sure no one was watching. The eggs had grown larger, and the leaf had begun to sag under the weight. He looked around to see if there was any pollen, but it had seemed to have all disappeared. Then suddenly, out of the corner of his eye, he saw 5 small grains of pollen on the edge of the leaf. He carefully brushed them into his hand, and as he did, they glowed like twinkling diamonds with all the beautiful colors of a rainbow. Luckily, he had an old envelope in his pocket with his timesheet in. He placed the pollen inside, smiled to himself, and set off back to work. Later that day, when all the heavy work of pollen harvesting was over, Bramley made his way to the hive. He scribbled his name on the back of the envelope and looked inside to make sure the golden pollen was still there. But there was one piece missing. He could only find 4. "Oh dear," he mumbled to himself. "It must have dropped out while I was working." He checked his pockets. Nothing. No time now to look, he thought. He sealed the envelope and buzzed over to the great hive door, where, standing at the entrance, was the guard bee, looking very smart and formal. "Bramley," said the guard, "what can's eyes do's for you's?" Looking very stern as he spoke, he squinted one eye to add to the effect. Bramley buzzed up closer. "I have a letter for the Queen," he said. "It's very important. Can's you get it to her for me?" The guard laughed. "Ha! Is it your resignation? Has you decided to harvest better pastures?" No," said Bramley. "It's just a letter. Can you please get it to her?" The guard frowned slightly and looked down at Bramley. He knew Bramley, and he knew that he was an honest, hard-working bee. After a few seconds, he said, I'll do my best. You go home now and let me see what I can do." It had been a long day. Bramley felt very tired and went home to rest and have a nap. But no sooner had he put his head on his pillow, there was loud banging on his door. Bramley jumped up suddenly, wondering who could be making so much noise. He went over to the door and opened it. To his surprise and shock, it was the guard he had given the letter to, along with 6 other guards. "Bramley," the guard said with a commanding voice, "you must come with us immediately. The Queen has demanded you come straight to the hive." Bramley had been hoping and envisaging seeing the Queen, but this was not quite how he had imagined. Bramley was told to wait in the small room at the back of the hive and not to touch anything by one of the Queen's hive superintendents. So he sat in silence. He was beginning to wonder whether he had done the right thing by sending the gold pollen, when suddenly the big doors at the end of the room swung open. The Queen entered, followed by the King, who was small, with a gray beard and spectacles. The Queen was large and much bigger. They were followed by an entourage of officials and busy-looking bees. The Queen looked at Bramley. "Are you the one who sent this envelope?" Holding it up in front of Bramley. "Are you Bramley?" Bramley stood in front of the Queen, feeling more than a little worried. He managed to shakily buzz the words out of his mouth. "Yes, Your Majesties." The Queen looked at the bee before her. "Tell me how you came by these," she asked, with a very stern, queen-like voice. The King, beside her, latching his glasses over the end of his nose, peered over them. Bramley took a deep breath and nervously started to tell the Queen and King how he came about to have the pollen in his possession. "My friend, the bee lady," he said nervously. "She—" "Bee lady?" asked the Queen suddenly. "What bee lady?" Bramley then hurriedly started to explain that the bee lady was a friend who thought she was a bee and dressed in a yellow-striped dress. The Queen and King turned and looked at each other suddenly with surprised expressions. "Stop," said the Queen abruptly to Bramley. She then turned to everyone in the room and asked them to leave. Bramley, the Queen, and the King stood alone in the small room. The Queen and King turned towards Bramley. The King spoke this time. "Are you absolutely sure? Tell us the whole story and how you came by this gold pollen." Bramley retold the story of how he met the bee lady, who was actually a butterfly, how they became friends, her disappearance, her return, and again her parting, and how she had asked him to watch over her eggs, her babies, and how he had seen her blow the golden pollen from her hand. "And these babies' eggs are where?" asked the Queen. Bramley stopped for a moment, remembering what the bee lady had asked of him. "Keep them secret. I trust yous." He had promised to keep the eggs safe and secret. The Queen looked at Bramley, sensing that he was struggling to answer her question. "No, don't tell us," the Queen suddenly said. "It's of no great concern to us. They're now your responsibility. You are now their guardian. You have been chosen." Bramley looked at the King and Queen with questioning eyes. "Chosen?" he asked. "Yes," said the King. "Chosen. You have been chosen. It's a great privilege." I don't understand, said Bramley. The queen went over to the chair in the corner and sat down. Let me tell yous a stories, Bramley, a veries old stories from a long time past. The king put his hand on Bramley's shoulder and gently guided him to a seat, and they both sat down. What I'm about to tell you, Bramley, is a stories handed down over many generations, and is steeped in myth and legends, the queen said, and only a few have heard the stories. Before the lands, seas, rivers, trees, and creatures were as we knows them today, the queen began, there was only one kind of creatures which flew with wings. They were called the dragonflyers, and their kind lived everywheres. They ruled the skies. Their queens were very beautiful. Their queens? Bramley interrupted. Yes, queens, the king said. The queen coughed and said, Let me continue. Their queens, sisters, and in fact twins, both ruled over the lands. Sedina and Beliza were their names. Boys and girls, I'm going to go ahead and stop here. For the next section, I will have another video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. In the description below, I have included links where you may find and purchase this book. Thank you for listening.